Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. We are excited about today's presentation featuring Chris Dobrik and Tom Mayblum of Armis. First, we would like to thank our webinar sponsor, Armis. Armis is the leading agentless device security, purpose-built to protect the world of unmanaged and IoT devices. They provide passive, real-time, and continuous asset inventory, risk management, and detection and response to prevent cyber attacks from disrupting and compromising your business. Armis has the world's largest device knowledge base, tracking over 280,000 devices. For more information, visit armis.com. Let's give one lucky attendee the opportunity to win a Webinar Wednesday Webinard t-shirt by telling us where the Armis U.S. headquarters is located. You can answer now by using the questions feature on your webinar dashboard. Armis has provided today's audience with a medical device security information handout for your use. This can be found in the Handouts section of your GoToWebinar dashboard. Please download and keep this information for your reference. A couple of reminders before we get started. Our next HTM Mixer will be October 1st and 2nd at the Hyatt Regency in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Join us for this two-day event filled with networking, continuing education, and vendor engagement. These mixers will provide a slightly modified, less crowded, and safer environment. You can learn more by visiting htmmixer.com. We are also hosting the MD Expo in Tampa, Florida this November. Registration is now open at mdexposhow.com. Okay, today's webinar is eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI. You can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. More details on this at the end of today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, our presenters today are Chris Dobrik and Tom Mayblum. They will answer pressing cybersecurity questions that all healthcare organizations need to answer to protect themselves and their patients against cybersecurity risks. Chris, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody to today's session, Why Cybersecurity is Difficult to Achieve for Healthcare Organizations. And I am joined not only by my colleague, Tom Mayblum, but also by my colleague, Curtis Simpson. My name is Chris Dobrik and I lead product marketing for Armis, but my esteemed colleagues provide quite a bit of insight into this area, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. Curtis, why don't you give the audience a little bit of your background?
You bet. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm Curtis Simpson. I am Chief Information Security Officer at Armis. I've been with Armis for about a year, and prior to joining Armis as CISO, I was global CISO and a customer of Armis at Cisco Foods. So I helped them build, maintain, and ultimately develop a world-class program to protect against many risks, including but not limited to IoT and OT risks. And with that, Tom, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Curtis. So hi, everyone. I'm Tom Mayblum. I'm a senior product manager at Armis and focused on healthcare products and customers. Prior to joining Armis, I was actually in the medical domain. I worked for a couple of medical device startups and also had my own startup that was developing a sophisticated ultrasound system based on computer vision. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Thanks, guys. And everyone, we're really looking forward to spending some time with you here. We'll spend about the next 45 minutes or so really looking at the medical device security challenge, talking about the new security playbook that we think needs to apply here, including how to take an agentless approach to the security problem. We'll talk a little bit about network segmentation and its role and historically providing some level of security and what some of the challenges in there, and we'll even get into some issues about ransomware and operationalizing things up to and including an actual use case that Curtis will walk you through. But as I jump in, I wanted to take an opportunity just to set the context of what we're going to discuss today. So Curtis, Tom, myself, we spend quite a bit of time talking to customers around the globe, particularly in the various verticals that we serve, and healthcare being a prime one. And by and large, when we speak to various customers and prospects in the healthcare industry, they really come at us with 6 primary concerns. First and foremost being we absolutely have to focus on patient safety and delivering care. It's our number one job. But in recent times, there's been more and more concern about things like ransomware and how that can disrupt the operation. There's always a concern about personal health information being leaked and data breach. But we also talk to folks about device utilization, the ability to do inventory, and another thing that we spend a lot of time talking to folks is what we like to call the other side of the house. But that's the broader network environment that is in the healthcare organization, up to including not only the medical devices themselves, but the broader IT systems and how they interact with one another. And so with that as a context, we really wanted to jump into a number of issues. First, we'll focus on the overall security and threat landscape that exists today. So let me hand it over to Curtis so he can give you a little perspective there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So there's a couple different perspectives I'll give you. One, in general, what are we facing, and then what is the healthcare industry facing specifically? So in general, we'll get into this a bit more in the next slide in terms of how this is actually happening. But in general, these devices being things that are not laptops, tablets, etc., being the medical devices we're actually using to service our customers and the infrastructure supporting those medical devices, are being targeted. They're being targeted because bad actors, whether we realize it or not, have actually been building their capabilities over recent years to target non-traditional devices. They're targeting the non-traditional devices for a number of different reasons, but ultimately because our ability to understand and respond to those attacks is challenging, and the damage they can do can be quite high. And as you see here, specific to the healthcare industry, the damage actually impacts mortality rates, unfortunately. And this isn't coming from us, but rather a number of different examples that you see here, speaking to the fact that both the event itself as well as the response to the event end up having a downstream impact on mortality rates. And unfortunately, we've seen attacks play out in the healthcare space that have been occurring while patients are connected to machines, whether that's patient monitors, CAT scan devices, infusion pumps. Unfortunately, these attacks play out when they do, and in many cases, that not only can mean that patients are being serviced at that point in time, but also that future patients might be impacted by that as well. And Chris, you can take it to the next slide. What I wanted to speak to is this holistic risk that healthcare is facing right now. So realize it or not, whether we realize it or not, most healthcare environments are interconnected environments, meaning that you've got traditional IT network-based devices, traditional devices like laptops and tablets, as well as the healthcare devices themselves running alongside one another in what's ultimately dubbed often in IT as a flat network. There may be some degree of segmentation in that these devices are segmented from others and can only communicate with certain devices in this way, but the vast majority of these environments consist of traditional IT devices like a server, a laptop, etc., the networks those devices are running on, and the healthcare devices that are also supporting or that are also running on those very same networks. So what you see before you right now are a few examples that all apply as I lay this scenario out the way that I did to a healthcare environment. Because if we look at from left to right, Urgent 11 was a set of vulnerabilities discovered by the ARMIS research team and disclosed last year that affected billions of devices around the world, everything from medical devices to devices that sit in industrial, more traditional enterprise environments, all the way to things like elevators and even the Mars rover. We're talking about a massive amount of devices used in many different forms and fashions within enterprises, You look at in February 2020, our research team also disclosed a set of vulnerabilities that existed within Cisco network devices. Nearly every single Cisco network device manufactured, and that many different networks in healthcare environments, or that healthcare environments are running on. So as we look at the network within a healthcare environment, both the traditional IT equipment as well as the healthcare equipment, it's often running on an environment that will be built upon devices like Cisco devices. Well, these vulnerabilities allow an attacker to compromise those devices and, long story short, take full control over that network. If they take full control over the network or the devices that support the network, they can then use that footprint to start disrupting those other devices that are important to your line of business, being those healthcare devices themselves. And then most recently, we've seen a very similar set of vulnerabilities to what we released in 2019 under Urgent 11, being disclosed by another research team, but once again, affecting hundreds of millions of devices, ranging from consumer to enterprise, traditional IT to healthcare devices. But the story here is that these are not the only 3 disclosures that have happened in the last couple of years, as you would imagine. In June and July alone, we've seen hundreds of disclosures spanning healthcare devices, OT, IoT, IT. These vulnerabilities are becoming more and more common because bad actors are looking for more opportunities to target and exploit our environments. And unfortunately, events like the global pandemic we're experiencing right now have highlighted some of these pain points, etc. And there's a greater concern that these vulnerabilities are being used against us if they're not actively being assessed and actively being managed. And with that, Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thanks, thanks, Curtis. Appreciate it. So, you know, with Curtis setting the backdrop in terms of the threat landscape and the threat environment, let's take a deeper look at the medical environment, the clinical environment, et cetera. And the interesting thing is, you know, from our perspective, when we go into the typical clinical environment, we see, you know, dozens of devices that are connected to the internet, to the network, and providing patient care. The ratio of which, you know, device to patient can be as much as 10 or 12 to 1 in any single scenario. And all of these devices are communicating to the, connected to and communicating on the network. The interesting thing you have to look at is the broader environment as well when you take into account my comments about the other side of the house. It's not just the clinical systems, but the traditional IT systems as well. And so everything from the traditional IT components like laptops and servers and printers and whatnot, but also the environmental controls and systems, everything from security cameras and smart lighting and smart heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. All of these things are sharing a common footprint in terms of the networks, and the threat landscape has been expanded dramatically because of that. The sorts of things that Curtis was just talking about don't target simply the traditional laptop desktop. They target some of these other, what we like to characterize as unmanaged or IoT devices as well. And so this is the thing that you have to consider as part of your cybersecurity programs moving forward. But when we transition that to what's the specific challenge with medical devices, it's really goes back to what I stated previously about they're increasingly connected to the network and exchanging data with the internet to other systems that exist out there. But the challenge historically has been that they simply don't have inherent security. They weren't designed with security in mind necessarily, and therefore they can't do things like accommodate a traditional security agent, the sort of thing that you would deploy on a laptop. Further, while there are techniques that you can scan these devices and probe them for potential vulnerabilities, scanning tends to be highly disruptive. And when you're in the business of providing care to patients and keeping them safe and getting them well, you know, you cannot disrupt those devices to perform a scan. And so this becomes the macro challenge that we see in the environment today. And so the question then becomes, you know, with all these new vulnerabilities that are emerging in terms of attacking the infrastructure, the devices themselves, as which is traditional IT, you know, how do you address these challenges and still meet your goals of maintaining and keeping patient safety as the highest priority? And the answer is you really need a new security playbook to address this. And our recommendation is that it starts with these primary things that you need in your playbook. Number one, you need to be able to provide security in an agentless fashion, not deploy agents out to those devices. Many cases, they simply can't accommodate an agent, and so having an agentless approach is definitely the way to go. Secondly, you have to be able to provide this without scanning those devices and disrupting them. And then thirdly, you need to be able to implement this in a fashion that is completely frictionless to the environment. So you don't need to install additional hardware sensors, this sort of thing. This is the playbook that we certainly recommend to our customers who deploy Armis. But let me spend a few minutes just talking about agentless and what that means. I've already made the statement that medical devices can't take an agent, and that legacy solutions that have been designed, previously to protect IT systems simply don't work here. But I can't overemphasize the importance of using an agentless approach to be able to look at network traffic and get an understanding of what those devices are actually doing from a behavioral perspective, profiling those devices, and then be able to make decisions as to what sort of behavior is anomalous. It's interesting, Curtis mentioned that we've actually seen in an actual environment, an infusion pump that was infected by malware. In that particular instance, the device was actually delivering care and couldn't be taken out of service. So we had to be able to, have that device continue to deliver service and yet maintain visibility into what the behavior of that device was doing, so as to not, potentially disrupt the delivery of care or the safety of that patient. But again, the way you do this is to have an agentless approach to be able to look at the network traffic and be able to determine what the behavior of those devices are to see if they are acting in an anomalous way. One of the things Curtis mentioned previously was about network segmentation and some of the vulnerabilities that we have seen, particularly a CD-PON, which impacts Cisco devices. Network segmentation has certainly been a way to isolate devices from one another, but as we're seeing, network segmentation alone is quite a challenge and is not a security answer in and of itself. Let me turn it over to Tom, because you've got some very specific perspectives on this that I think the audience would love to hear, Tom.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, network segmentation is being viewed many times as a way to generate security and kind of segregate your medical devices from your entire network. But this is, first of all, only partially true, as segmentation, it does not mean that attackers cannot cross boundaries and cannot get into your segmented part of medical devices. And the other thing is that many times when segmentation is applied, it actually creates a blind spot for IT and healthcare employees that need to monitor those devices. So let me dive into a specific example here of a network that we saw that was quite common in a few customers, and this is the GE CareScape network. So the GE CareScape network is basically a segregated network that is built by GE as a product that basically segregates all the patient monitors, telemetry systems, and central stations that GE uses to monitor patients. And these devices are basically communicating over dedicated network equipment, over specific VLANs that are created and monitored by GE. But the thing is that this whole network is not managed by the hospital IT. They have a zero to very little visibility into the devices in that network. So the hospital doesn't know what's in there, what are these devices doing, what kind of risks and vulnerabilities they have. And we've been asked by customers to try and gain visibility into that network because it's a blind spot for them. So basically, this is what we did, and we looked into the traffic that does come out from this network through a dedicated gateway, and we saw a couple of very interesting things. So this is the general overview of a deployment, a typical deployment of the network. On the left, you'll see all the patient monitors, telemetry systems, etc. These are going over dedicated network switches and go out through a specific gateway. Specific messages from this network comes out through this gateway to the hospital system, but the devices themselves are not visible to the hospital. When we looked into the traffic coming out of this gateway, this is what we saw. So basically, we were able to see traffic coming out of these devices, the internal devices within the supposedly segregated network that were sending out information through a proprietary protocol that was developed by GE to basically report their information, including their internal IP addresses, their types, whether they're monitors and monitor models, clinical information centers, central stations, and telemetry systems. They were reporting their actual and accurate locations, in which room and department they were. And most interestingly, they were also reporting clinical data, including protected health information, such as patient names, locations, and their vital signs in a clear text, basically. So we were able to capture all that, analyze it, process it in real time, and we're able to show these assets as well. We can see those devices even if they're in the segregated network. We know exactly what device types they are, we know what they're doing, and we know where they're located. And actually, we know which patients are connected to them and what the vital signs are. Now, it's important to note that ARMIS doesn't store any patient information or any PHI, but we do register that it was transmitted, and we're able to then generate a risk factor and generate activities saying this device was transmitting PHI in a non-encrypted way. So generally speaking, PHI or protected health information is something that obviously is under HIPAA compliance. So hospitals and caregivers are instructed not to transmit those in an unencrypted, unprotected fashion. Obviously, we do see that many times being transmitted in a clear text or unencrypted within a hospital in the internal network, which is sometimes considered as trivial, even though, again, if an attacker gains access to your network, they can also gain access to that information, even if it's only within your hospital perimeter. And the device manufacturers usually don't, they don't take ownership or accountability for this. They simply pass on the information in clear text and say, well, that's the hospital problem because those devices communicate within the hospital. So as long as it stays within the hospital and the hospital's perimeter is secure, then everything is fine. But first of all, again, it's still not 100% accurate when an attacker gains access. But interestingly enough, we also see cases where this PHI is being sent externally and to locations outside the network and is being transmitted in an unencrypted fashion. And in ARMIS, we have the ability to differentiate and say whether the PHI was sent internally and to whom, and also whether it was sent externally. And we can also say what kind of information was passed, whether it was patient information, social security numbers, addresses, medical images, vital signs, etc. And again, we don't store that exact information or the actual values, but we just know or register that the information itself was passed. So this is basically a very good example of why network segmentation doesn't always provide security and actually may create a problem for healthcare IT.
Yeah, great, Tom. Thanks for that great explanation of how network segmentation doesn't always achieve its ultimate goal, but more importantly, the notion of PHI data being sent on the internet unencrypted, and then even potentially being sent externally, which is certainly a HIPAA violation. But the more important thing, as we were describing, the challenges of medical device security and then the regular IT environment and all the vulnerabilities. When you mix those two together, it's absolutely a challenge for clinical and IT and security teams on a global basis. And so I did want to spend a few minutes just talking about ARMIS and what our mission is. And our mission is to actually enable organizations to be able to utilize these technologies, adopt these new types of connected devices, but do so without fear of compromise by cyber attack. And we built a platform that was purpose-built for this mission. So let me turn it over to Curtis, to speak to not only the details of the platform, but also what it was like to use it, practically speaking, in your prior life.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And as Chris mentioned, everything I'm going to describe is not just from the product perspective, but from a practitioner standpoint in terms of what I was able to deliver as a global security leader within an organization using ARMIS. So first and foremost, ARMIS will discover everything. When I say everything, I mean everything, as long as that thing communicates on a network in any capacity. This means all of your IT devices, your IoT devices, your OT devices, whether or not they're managed by something else today, it doesn't matter. We will find them. We will actually apply attribution to those devices, help you understand what they are, not just make, model, and OS, but much more, up to 8,000 points of attribution, depending on what the device is. And this is all based upon what was touched on earlier, the differentiating knowledge base that we've built of nearly 300 million unique devices, meaning that we don't just understand what these devices look like in your environment, we understand what they look like in every customer environment, which is why we don't just discover them, we discover them with complete certainty. And that when we tell you what a device is, you know that's what the device is, because we've rationalized it's what it does, how it acts, across every single customer implementation in every industry, every sector, etc. And I've truly witnessed this, deploying it into every one of our locations, whether that was, regardless of the footprint of the location, the geography of the location, ARMIS discovered every one of those assets, whether it was communicating over proprietary OT protocols, over basic network protocols between IoT and IT devices, and even over 2.4 gigahertz and Bluetooth and Zigbee and Z-Wave, whatever it was, ARMIS found it. And once ARMIS finds it and tells you exactly what it is, ARMIS won't just tell you what it is, but what's normal to that thing. How does it normally act? What typically communicates with this device? At what frequency? What is it normally passing to the device? At what size? Over what ports and protocols are being used between these communications? If this device is a device that's likely owned by a user, what is the likely owner of the device based upon the user that's continually logging into the device? You have full visibility at your fingertips to understand what's normal for these devices, but then what ARMIS does based upon that understanding is help you identify whether you've got specific risks of concern. We talk about, recently we've been having a lot of conversations around the recent ban of a number of manufacturers and their devices, if those devices are being used in an enterprise servicing the federal government. So we can help you identify those risks within your environment, vulnerabilities based upon all of the components used to build the devices, meaning we won't just tell you what vulnerabilities exist with the device, but with the software running on the device. So you have full visibility into the vulnerabilities themselves, as well as exploitation of those vulnerabilities. We won't just tell you about risks and vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but when they are being actively exploited. We'll get into this in a few moments, but we help our customers every day identify when a vulnerability is being exploited in their traditional IT environments or their OT and IoT environments, such as healthcare devices being used to service patients. We'll identify when they're actively being exploited, and then finally help facilitate a response. And that response is valuable in terms of what we can facilitate, because not only are we helping to identify that a device may have been compromised, we're able to integrate with existing SIMs and SOARs and provide the expected level of attribution that's expected by the team responding to any other security event happening anywhere else within the environment. You no longer need an OT or IoT expert to understand an attack that's playing out in the landscape, because the attribution we're sharing around that attack is in the same general format expected and typically assessed by security practitioners day in and day out. And even in addition to that, we're augmenting and enhancing other capabilities in that space, because where other solutions may be finding potential events that they're looking for throughout the environment, but may not know what device is associated with the event, we can help them with that. Those other devices can actually integrate with Armis for that device attribution detail that we provide through that differentiating knowledge base. Meaning that through this overall integration, you can enable something like a SOAR to fully understand everything that's happening with the environment and respond to it from beginning to end. And finally, that response even includes integrating with advanced network capabilities that you may have, like a NAC, and truly enhancing NAC's capability to not just be that bouncer that's determining who is or is not allowed on the network, but to actually use NAC as a tool to either manually or automatically isolate a likely compromised device within that environment. This becomes something you can use in the moment when an attack is playing out to actually stop the attack in its tracks by, again, isolating the device, whether it's automatically by a SOAR or manually by the SOC. And all of this, as you note on the bottom, happens passively, no installation of agents, no active scans against boxes, nothing that can disrupt a healthcare device from actually delivering services, delivering care, etc. This happens in real time. This is not happening at a given moment based upon a given schedule, and if something happens outside of the schedule, you miss it. No, it's happening in real time, and it's happening continuously. This is not a point in time event. This is a continuous value stream from beginning to end, and discovering, assessing for risk, and responding to those potential events within your environment. Very powerful, and I can say on a global scale, was very powerful in managing risk across our complex environment while I was at Cisco.
Excellent, thanks, Curtis. And we're very pleased that Forrester has even recognized the capabilities of Armis in this context. The Forrester Connected Medical Device Security New Wave, which was just released a couple months ago, we were named a leader there. But the report itself, and you can get it from our website, really the analytics that Forrester employed was to look at everything from architecture, analytics and reporting, device discovery, threat research, vulnerability management, a whole host of vectors, and really focused on the capabilities of the leading vendors in this space. And we were very pleased to be named one of those leaders. And one of the interesting, most salient points that came out of that report is they identified us as being the company that is best for organizations that are seeking a security solution that adequately addresses both the clinical side of the house as well as the IT side of the house. So it's something that we urge you to consider as well. There was actually some good quotes that came out of that, particularly when it came to discovering devices and enhancing knowledge of inventory in addition to the security capabilities. But one of the things I wanted to do was now, along with Curtis, go into some specific use cases, some examples from our healthcare customers where we've gone in and helped them perform all these activities and tasks. So Curtis, let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So what I'm going to take us through over the next few moments is an actual engagement with a customer. So this was a customer that engaged Armis to achieve specific outcomes that are presented in front of you, and I'll talk through in a moment. And this was ultimately a POC or a POV, a proof of concept or a proof of value, assessing products on the market against these desired outcomes and seeing which product was the best fit. So the actual outcomes, as you see here, were firstly to discover all of the devices. So I talked about Armis's ability to truly discover all of the things that communicate over any network in any capacity. This healthcare customer is very much looking to identify everything from IT to IoT to OT being used in every capacity throughout their environment, because they had, as many healthcare environments do, a very flat network as we described earlier. And in terms of threat analysis, they not only wanted to detect and identify all these different devices, but be able to assess these devices for risk, identify any malicious or anomalous activity that may just point to a malfunctioning device, and of course, identify any potential exposures to the business.
And Curtis, one of the things that came back was the CISO feedback in terms of very specifically some of the things that we were able to accomplish against those objectives. But I think what may be most interesting to this audience is the things that we discovered along the way. So let's dive into a very particular incident where we were able to actively identify WannaCry infecting their environment. If you go back to one of the things that this particular audience was looking for, they had already seen a very high incidence of SMB traffic, and SMB is a protocol that is used in Windows machines, and it happens to be a high correlation with malware such as WannaCry. But Curtis, would love for you to dive in for the audience and let them know what we actively saw in this environment.
Yeah, of course. So I spoke to how we got started with this engagement. And almost immediately after initiating this engagement with this customer, they reached out to us for the exact reason that Chris mentioned. They noticed that SMB traffic, a common, very specific technical protocol that's used as part of an older version of SMB, is used as part of the WannaCry attack. Well, the customer reached out because they noticed that through their traditional solutions, meaning endpoint security or otherwise known as antivirus solutions, that their antivirus solution had identified a number of devices that had either attempted to be or were affected by WannaCry. But they'd only identified 60 devices. As they were looking at the network traffic, just raw network traffic, to try to understand what was coming in and going out of the network, and what were they seeing over SMB, they saw a massive amount of traffic. So because we had just initiated this POC or POV with this customer, they immediately pivoted over to us and looked to Armis both as a solution and as a company to help them here. And we were able to help rapidly. And what you see here is what we were able to help with. So we'd already stood up the solution in one or two of the locations within this specific customer. It so happened to be one of those locations that was being affected. Through their traditional solutions, the entire stack, including AV products, network capabilities, etc., that identified 60 specific devices that had been infected by and were involved in this attack. We identified 60 times that. So 15 times 60. Those attacks had migrated into their healthcare devices. Whether we realize it or not, many of the devices in healthcare environments, manufacturing environments, and others are actually running on traditional operating systems. They're using Windows, they're using Linux, and often older versions of these operating systems, and using these older protocols to communicate, or at least these protocols are enabled. So there's a couple of reasons why I mention this, both in terms of this specific attack and what you're seeing here, in terms of the medical devices being impacted, but also because of what we're seeing in terms of bad actor or attacker trends. Ransomware is not going away. Unfortunately, ransomware has been one of the greatest, in air quotes, success stories in the cyber crime area that they've ever seen. And again, not going away. If anything, what we've seen is a doubling down on ransomware to quickly move from traditional IT, laptops, desktops, servers, into OT and IoT. And I just want to take a minute to talk about that and why that's so important in an environment like this, because again, going back to, these are generally flat networks, everything's ultimately connected to one another. Even when things are segmented, there's still reasons why that's not a silver bullet. The reality of what we're facing is bad actors, when they look at a medical target today, are thinking, how do I quickly get from laptops into medical devices? Because enterprises like a medical enterprise, a healthcare enterprise, are able to, or have learned how to back up servers, how to back up those traditional IT devices, so that when we compromise them with ransomware, they can recover quickly. Bad actors have been pivoting and changing those attacks to get to devices that we can't recover quickly. I know in the environment that I was in, there was many of the devices that were traditional manufacturing devices that we used on our shop floors, warehouse floors, produce meat floors, etc. Because if they were compromised, that meant I actually needed another device. There wasn't a backup, there wasn't something on tape, something in the cloud, something I could go back to and recover from in minutes. I actually needed to have another device that I could swap out. And as we're facing the supply chain challenges that we've all seen play out over the last 6 months, this is a greater concern than it's ever been. So as we do think about these attacks playing out and think about attacks as to how they play out, we do need to look at these things ultimately as one large network, as very similar devices, and that bad actors are trying to get to the devices we care about most, because if they compromise them, we're likely to pay. So as we think about our environments and we think about managing risk going forward, I think it's important to both note the trend but note the positivity and the fact that Armis and the likes of Armis are able to actually help our customers understand these risks, assess for these risks, and respond to the attack if it happens in a litany of different ways. And many of our customers today are able to effectively prevent these attacks from moving from IT into those critical networks so they can avoid the 60 times 15 devices being impacted as we're seeing here.
Yeah, and Curtis, your experience at Cisco is interesting. I've heard you speak previously about refrigeration and the impact on that business, but refrigeration or even heating, ventilation, and air conditioning or security cameras in a healthcare delivery environment are equally as vulnerable and need to be considered here as well, right?
Yeah, very good point, Chris. And I'm glad you brought that up, because as we do think about those common footprints and the implications there, one of the specific risks, just to put it out there, that I was managing at Cisco was the fact that the temperature sensor for a refrigeration unit and the refrigeration unit itself are two different devices. And I can change the temperature on a refrigeration unit and tell the temperature sensor to not change, meaning that if that unit is supposed to be 38 degrees, I can change the refrigeration unit to be 50 degrees, but cause the sensor to keep reporting 38 degrees. Very problematic in a lot of different scenarios. When you think about food service, hugely critical, but you think about medical, to your point, very critical. And as you think about other devices that are used to monitor our environments, et cetera, like those cameras, Chris, very relevant as well. If we think about a lot of the newsworthy events around how bad actors have been exploiting these devices in healthcare environments and otherwise, they've been exploiting the devices that are most common. So what is something that's common to healthcare, to manufacturing, traditional offices? It's your printers, it's your cameras, and it's your network equipment. And we've seen the likes of Russia specifically go after public and private sector left and right using just those capabilities, being able to hop into a network, compromise a laptop, move into cameras, printers, network devices, go invisible, and then go after those other things that will hopefully reap a very large ransom payout, are some of the trends that we're seeing unilaterally. This is not specific to manufacturing, not specific to healthcare, but equally as damaging across all industries, and something we very much need to be thinking about.
Great. So thanks, Curtis, for that perspective. Let me bring it on home for the audience, and then we can open up to questions. But the part of this security playbook that we are urging you all to consider when it comes to protecting your medical devices and broader environment is to be able to see everything. And it's not just the medical devices, but it's more. It's the IT systems, the IoT systems, all of which that are interconnected there, and do it in a manner that doesn't require agents or scanning. In the end, what this will allow us to do is, certainly improve patient care, but really focus on the things that matter, and that's reducing, risk to patient safety, reducing costs related to operational downtime. Things that the impact that ransomware is having on healthcare delivery organizations is pretty dramatic, but also focusing on the other things that matter in terms of minimizing a breach of patient data, PHI data, and overall, and just give you the confidence that you can run your business and run your operations in a safe and secure manner. So with that, I'm going to pause and open up for questions.
Great, thank you. Let's go to our questions that have come in so far. As a reminder, if you have any questions for the presenters, please use your question feature on your webinar dashboard. Our first question is, with the lack of security controls incorporated into the design and functionality of medical devices, how best can one approach the problem of how to identify vulnerabilities and associated risks?
Thanks, Jennifer. Curtis, I'll start with that one, then maybe you can jump in here. So the approach that we recommend is to use a network-based approach. Again, I've already discussed the challenges with the security agents and medical devices, but the way to do a detailed inspection of the environment to discover all the various attributes of those devices is essentially to get that information from the network, to be able to glean all the detailed information about the devices and what makes them up in terms of make, model, operating system, version, applications, et cetera. And then, once you use the network to identify those devices, then be able to look at communications between and amongst those devices to analyze behavior. You can then subsequently apply some heuristics to understand if a device is behaving in an anomalous way or not, but also have the ability to tie that to other databases, whether it's MDS2, FDA recall and whatnot, vulnerability and CVE data. All this stuff can be gleaned initially from the network and then used to correlate with a system such as ARMIS to identify those particular devices that don't have that inherent security. I don't know, Curtis, if you have anything else to add.
Not much, because that was spot on. The only thing I would add would be everything Chris said is spot on, with the only nuance being that the solution has to understand the context of these devices in general, right? So one of the things that I ran into was trying to use network-based solutions that were built around understanding context of IT devices to then try to extrapolate what I was dealing with in terms of IoT and OT in my environment, which is what ultimately led me to ARMIS, because those traditional solutions were giving me a whole lot of unknowns that I was having to chase down. They were creating more work than they were actually managing in terms of risk. So something to be cognizant of as you're assessing solutions is they've got to have new world context in terms of the devices that exist within your environment.
Yeah, great point, Curtis. So, Becton Dickinson, infusion pump rate, you need to have a baseline of how those devices are intended to behave in order to discover if any specific infusion pump is behaving anomalously.
Exactly.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is the biggest cybersecurity threat that healthcare organizations need to be aware of, given the current impacts that COVID-19 is having on each and every organization?
Well, I think Curtis and Tom, you probably would both agree that ransomware and the spread of ransomware is probably the biggest concern that all healthcare delivery organizations need to be aware of right now. I guess the key challenge is, how to prevent the spread of that, and then what are the different entry points and attack vectors that you need to consider. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree, especially if you look at what we spoke to today. It's really, unfortunately, most healthcare environments very much do have the flat network we spoke to earlier, which consists of IoT, OT, and IT devices, which also means that any of the vulnerabilities that exist across all those devices could theoretically be exploited, either to break into the environment or used to move laterally through the environment, and all likely with the goals of ransomware, less so than going after PHI. Because ransomware, like I spoke to earlier, is often known for a higher, more real-time payout than having to steal that PHI, put it up on the dark web or through some other market, sell it. The time to value, as it were, for the bad actor is a lot longer for stealing the data. So there's a lot higher of a desire to execute the type of attack I spoke to earlier, which means get into the medical devices as quickly as possible, compromise them, and demand a ransom that you know is going to have to be paid because those devices cannot be recovered from. So as we speak about that and as we think about that, it really goes back to being able to understand that holistic environment, understand when an attack, because this is how they're typically playing out, is being executed within the traditional IT landscape, and then being able to identify it, respond to it, and stop it before it floods into or spreads into the critical environment.
All right, our next question is, as more and more medical devices get connected to traditional IT networks, what is the best practice you have seen for how healthcare organizations can address the growing number of cybersecurity threats targeted at hospitals?
So that's actually an excellent question. And what we have observed, what I have certainly observed, is that it takes a village here. And by it takes a village, I mean it really takes the combination of clinical engineering, IT, security staff, the manufacturers themselves, and even government entities. If I look at our experience last year with Urgent 11, for example, we were able to not only work with a number of our customers who potentially had exposures, but with the device manufacturers themselves, as well as the FDA, to really go out and make a strong statement about what organizations need to do collectively. But I really think it takes a combination of clinical engineering working hand in glove with IT and security and your vendors to really address this.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add would be, as we think about, because interestingly enough, I come from an environment that actually bears a lot of similarities with healthcare in terms of many devices that provide a critical service on behalf of the organization that 5, 10, 15 years old, still working as they were meant to day one. There may be patches available for them, but they can't be applied for a number of different reasons. One of the things that we did in my time on the enterprise side was actually start implementing the concept of virtual patching, meaning that we would use ARMIS specifically to create policies around how certain critical communications happen within our environment. And if those critical communications fell outside of those policies, we would use some of our network integrations to stop those other communications, to shut them down and alert my team, which ultimately meant that even though we weren't patching some of those devices, the opportunity to exploit them was limited, because we'd limited the path to be able to communicate with those devices to only the things that were allowed to communicate with them, and that we wanted to communicate with them over specific ports and protocols. So as we think about these environments, some of these problems aren't going away. Certain devices we're going to need to continue to use. They still can't be patched. We're going to be living through those challenges for a long time. We need a solution that helps us manage risks without having to patch, which ultimately means we've got to manage policies at a network level based upon our understanding of context around how things work in our environment. And ARMIS truly helps you solve everything I just said from beginning to end.
Thank you, Chris and Tom, for a great presentation. I'd like to encourage everyone to visit today's sponsor to learn more about the products they provide to our industry. Visit armis.com. A quick reminder that you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey. The survey will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your 1 CE credit from the ACI. And you will be able to download your certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. We will be back next week with another webinar. Visit webinarwednesday.live for more details and complimentary registration.